He bought a cheap ranch at auction, but it came with a gorgeous wife. James Harrison had always lived a quiet life in the small town of Dayton, Ohio. He was the kind of man who enjoyed the steady rhythm of routine. Every morning he would wake up before sunrise, make his cup of coffee, and review his work schedule. By 9, he would be at his desk, crunching numbers, balancing budgets, and helping clients organize their finances. It was a predictable life, orderly and safe, and James liked it that way. Yet, in the quiet corners of his mind, he sometimes dreamed of something different, something a little wilder than spreadsheets and office meetings. One chilly autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell outside his window, James was scrolling through online listings while waiting for his lunch break. He had no real intention of making any changes to his life, but his curiosity led him to an auction website. Most of the listings were ordinary, old furniture, vehicles, farm equipment, but one listing caught his eye. It was for a ranch far out in the rural countryside of Texas being sold at auction. The pictures were simple, a large stretch of land dotted with oak trees, a weathered barn, and a modest farmhouse. From the photos, the ranch seemed neglected but full of potential. The most striking detail, however, was the price. It was unbelievably low. James blinked at the screen, convinced he had misread it. There had to be a mistake. He double-checked the listing. The auction was happening in 2 weeks, and the property would go to the highest bidder. He leaned back in his chair, thinking it over. A ranch was a far cry from his neat little life in Ohio, but he had always felt a pull toward open spaces and wide skies. The idea of owning land, even if it was rundown, stirred a strange excitement in him. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. For the next few days, James couldn't stop thinking about the ranch. He imagined himself walking across the sprawling fields, feeling the wind against his face, and watching the sunset from the porch of the farmhouse. He imagined the sense of freedom that came with owning a place like that. The more he thought about it, the more the idea became irresistible. On a whim, he decided he would go to the auction, even if it was just to look. When the day of the auction arrived, James drove for hours through winding roads, past rolling hills and scattered farmhouses. He was nervous, unsure of what to expect. The closer he got, the more his excitement grew. He had never been to a real estate auction before, and he felt like he was stepping into a world completely different from his own. The auction house was a large, old building with peeling paint and creaky wooden floors. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of dust and old paper. People were milling about, some chatting quietly, others studying the auction catalog. James took a deep breath and found a seat near the back. The auctioneer, a tall man with a booming voice, began calling out properties one by one. James tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to the ranch. When the auctioneer finally called out the lot number for the Texas ranch, James's heart began to race. He glanced at the catalog again to make sure he had the right number. He did. This was it. The bidding started slowly. A few people raised their paddles, but the numbers stayed surprisingly low. James hesitated, feeling a sudden wave of doubt. Was he really ready to buy a ranch? He had no experience, no plan, and certainly no idea what he would do with it. But then he reminded himself why he had come here in the first place. He wanted something different, something that could change his life. Taking a deep breath, he raised his own paddle. The bidding continued back and forth until it was just James and another bidder, a man with a confident air who seemed determined to win. The auctioneer's voice rang through the room. "Do I hear one last bid?" James felt his palms sweat. He didn't want to back down, not now. With a firm nod, he raised his paddle once more. The hammer fell. He had won. James sat there for a moment, stunned. He had bought a ranch. It was real. The excitement surged through him, mixing with a little fear. He was about to leave behind the life he knew, stepping into a world that felt completely foreign. The auction staff handed him the necessary paperwork, and he carefully went over each page, making sure everything was in order. Finally, with a sigh that was part relief and part anticipation, he signed the documents. After the auction, James found a small inn nearby where he could stay the night before traveling to his new property. That evening, he sat by the window, looking out at the vast landscape, imagining the life that awaited him. He pictured mornings spent tending the land, evenings on the porch watching the sunset, and weekends exploring the surrounding countryside. It felt like a dream, a life he had only ever pictured in his mind. The next morning, James set out for the ranch, driving along dusty country roads lined with towering trees and fields of tall grass. As he approached, the property unfolded before him like a scene from a storybook. The farmhouse was quaint but worn, with paint peeling from the walls and a sagging porch that creaked under his weight. The barn was sturdy but weathered, the roof showing signs of years of neglect. The land itself was beautiful, rolling gently with patches of wildflowers and clusters of oak trees. James felt a mix of awe and determination. He could see the potential. He could make this place his own. But as he pulled up to the farmhouse and stepped out of his car, he noticed something unexpected. A woman was standing on the porch, watching him with a calm but curious expression. She was strikingly beautiful, with long hair that shone in the morning sun and eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of surprise and amusement. James froze for a moment, unsure how to react. He had expected an empty property, maybe a few caretakers or animals, but not a person. The woman introduced herself as Clara. She explained with a small, knowing smile that she had been living on the ranch for several years. James was taken aback. The auction listing had not mentioned anything about a resident, let alone someone as charismatic and confident as Clara. She explained that the previous owner, a reclusive man who had passed away, had set up the sale in a very unusual way. Whoever purchased the ranch would also be responsible for her, as she had been under the owner's care. James struggled to process this. He had come expecting an empty ranch, a fresh start, and now there was a person, a vibrant, independent woman, living there. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Clara seemed calm, as if she had seen this reaction countless times before. She assured him that she was not a burden and that she only wished to continue living peacefully on the ranch. Over the next few hours, James began to explore the property, while Clara followed, offering practical advice about the land, the barn, and the fields. He noticed how familiar she was with every inch of the ranch, how she moved with ease, and how her knowledge of the land far surpassed his own. Despite the initial shock, James felt a strange sense of relief. He realized he was not entirely alone in this new adventure. Clara's presence, while unexpected, might actually help him adjust to this unfamiliar life. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, James and Clara sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the first stars appear. The ranch was quiet, except for the gentle rustle of the trees and the distant sound of livestock. James felt a mixture of excitement, fear, and curiosity. He knew that owning a ranch would be challenging, and living alongside Clara would bring its own unique dynamics. Yet, as he looked at the vast land before him and the woman beside him, he felt a spark of possibility. This was the beginning of something entirely new. James had bought a ranch, yes, but he had also stepped into a life full of surprises, challenges, and unexpected connections. He didn't yet know how it would all unfold, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. And as the night settled over the quiet countryside, he realized that this ranch, this adventure, and yes, even Clara, were about to change his life forever. The next morning, James woke to the sound of birds singing outside the farmhouse window. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the room with a warm glow. He stretched and took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for the reality of life on the ranch. He had imagined wide open spaces and quiet mornings, but he hadn't yet imagined living alongside Clara, the unexpected resident who had arrived with the property. Breakfast was awkward at first. Clara had already prepared eggs and fresh bread, and she moved around the small kitchen with practiced ease. James had never been much of a cook, preferring coffee and toast, but he forced a smile and thanked her. "I suppose we'll need to get used to working together," he said, trying to sound confident. Clara raised an eyebrow but didn't answer. Instead, she set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. After breakfast, Clara suggested that they take a tour of the ranch. James agreed, still curious about the property and eager to learn. They started at the barn, where the smell of hay and the sight of old tools reminded James of the work that awaited him. The barn had clearly been neglected, with broken boards, a leaking roof, and dust covering every surface. Clara explained how the barn had once housed horses and cows, and she pointed out areas that needed urgent repair. James listened carefully, trying to remember everything. He knew that restoring the barn would be a huge task, but seeing Clara's calm confidence made him feel that it was possible. Next, they walked through the fields. The grass was long and tangled, and wildflowers grew in clusters along the edges. James imagined the land as it might have been years ago, full of life and carefully maintained. Clara told him stories about the seasons, about planting crops, and the challenges of keeping animals healthy. James realized that she had a deep connection to this land, one that he didn't yet fully understand. He felt a mix of admiration and nervousness. How would he fit into this world so completely different from his life in Ohio? As they walked, Clara also told him about the previous owner. He had been a wealthy man, eccentric and private, who loved the ranch and had made it his sanctuary. He had cared for Clara, almost like family, and had left instructions that she should continue to live there no matter who bought the property. James nodded, realizing the complexity of the situation. Clara was not just a visitor or a caretaker. She was part of the ranch's history. He had inherited more than land. He had inherited a responsibility. Over the next few days, James began to settle into a routine, though it was far from easy. The barn needed immediate repairs, fences were broken, and weeds had overtaken the gardens. Every task reminded him that owning a ranch was nothing like his quiet life back home. Yet he found that working alongside Clara made the work more manageable. She was patient and knowledgeable, showing him how to mend fences, clean stalls, and care for the few animals left on the property. James struggled at first, fumbling with tools and making mistakes, but Clara never criticized him. Instead, she encouraged him, offering guidance with a gentle, firm hand. Despite the growing cooperation, tension sometimes flared. James was used to making decisions alone, while Clara was confident in her ways and didn't hesitate to suggest alternatives. At first, James bristled when she corrected him, but over time, he began to see the value in her experience. There were moments when he wanted to retreat, to return to the safety of his predictable life, but the ranch demanded attention. He realized he had no choice but to adapt. One afternoon, James decided to explore a small creek that ran along the edge of the property. Clara joined him, and they walked in silence, listening to the water trickle over stones. The creek was beautiful, shaded by overhanging trees, and James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Clara spoke softly about the wildlife that visited the creek, the fish in the water, and the birds that nested nearby. James was fascinated by her knowledge and by the way she seemed to belong to this place. That evening, as they returned to the farmhouse, James felt a strange mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. The work had been hard, but it had also been rewarding. He realized that the ranch was teaching him something about himself. He was learning patience, resilience, and the value of hard work. And in small ways, he was beginning to appreciate Clara not just as a companion to the land, but as a person with her own story, her own strength, and her own perspective. Over the next week, James faced another challenge. A small group of cattle had wandered into the wrong field, and he and Clara spent hours rounding them up. James had never handled livestock before, and the experience was intimidating. The animals were strong, unpredictable, and not inclined to cooperate. Clara guided him through each step, demonstrating how to approach the cattle, how to use the fences, and how to remain calm even when things went wrong. James followed her lead, learning quickly but also realizing how much he still had to understand. Through these challenges, a subtle bond began to form. James started to notice Clara's sense of humor, her kindness, and her unwavering calm under pressure. She noticed his determination, his willingness to learn, and the way he didn't give up even when the work seemed impossible. Neither spoke much about the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, but a quiet respect grew between them. They learned to anticipate each other's movements, to communicate with gestures, and to trust each other's judgment. One evening, after a long day of repairs, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the air was cool and crisp. James felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in years. He thought about how unexpected this journey had been, how a simple auction had led him to a ranch, and how that ranch had led him to Clara. He realized that life could be full of surprises, and sometimes the most challenging circumstances brought the greatest rewards. As the days turned into weeks, James continued to settle into life on the ranch. The barn slowly took shape, fences were repaired, and the fields began to look cared for. Clara and James had fallen into a rhythm, each learning from the other, each contributing in their own way. James still struggled with some aspects of ranch life, but he no longer felt overwhelmed. He felt capable, confident, and strangely alive. Yet, even as things improved, James could not ignore the underlying question that had been in the back of his mind since the moment he met Clara. What did this unusual arrangement mean for their future? They worked well together, but they were two very different people with very different lives. How would they navigate the unexpected connection that had formed between them? James didn't have an answer, and perhaps he never would. For now, he focused on the work, the land, and the small victories that came each day. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the edge of the property, James found an old wooden box buried in the dirt. Inside were letters and photographs belonging to the previous owner. He brought the box to Clara, and together they sifted through its contents. The letters revealed the owner's deep affection for the ranch and his care for Clara. James realized that the ranch was not just land and buildings. It was a legacy, a story, and a home. Clara's presence, once a shock, now felt natural. She was a part of the history, and in some ways she was helping him become part of it too. By the end of the month, James began to feel a sense of belonging. The ranch was no longer just a property he had purchased on a whim. It was a place that demanded effort, attention, and care, but it was also a place of beauty, growth, and possibility. Clara had become an unexpected guide, mentor, and companion. The initial shock of her presence had faded, replaced by understanding, respect, and the beginnings of friendship. James knew that challenges lay ahead. The work would never truly be finished, and living alongside Clara would continue to present surprises. Yet he also knew that he was ready. He had discovered a part of himself he hadn't known existed, a part willing to take risks, embrace uncertainty, and adapt to a life far different from the one he had known. And as he looked out across the fields, watching the wind ripple through the tall grass, he felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The ranch, Clara, and the life that awaited him were still full of unknowns. But for the first time, James felt ready to face them all. Life on the ranch was starting to feel more like reality and less like a dream for James. Each morning, he woke to the soft light of dawn spilling into the farmhouse, the distant crowing of a rooster, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Even though he had spent years in the predictable comfort of his office, he had begun to adapt to this new rhythm. Waking early, feeding animals, repairing fences, and tending to the land had become part of his life. But no matter how hard he worked, there were always new challenges waiting around the corner. One morning, James discovered that a section of the fence had collapsed during the night, leaving a group of sheep wandering dangerously close to the creek. He cursed quietly under his breath, knowing that retrieving them would not be easy. Clara had already gone ahead to the barn, gathering supplies and organizing the effort. Watching her move with such purpose, James felt a mix of admiration and mild intimidation. She seemed completely at home here, while he still sometimes felt like a visitor in this world. "Careful, James," Clara called, her voice calm but firm. "They can sense hesitation. Move slowly and they'll follow you." James nodded and approached the sheep, trying to remember the techniques Clara had taught him. The animals shuffled nervously, bleating as he slowly guided them toward the barn. It took nearly 2 hours to round them all up, and by the time they were safely enclosed, James was exhausted. Clara gave him a small smile, noticing the sweat on his brow and the dirt on his clothes. "You're improving," she said. "By next month you might even enjoy this." James laughed, shaking his head. "I doubt it," he admitted, though he felt a strange sense of pride in having accomplished the task. It was moments like these, hard, tiring, yet oddly satisfying, that made him realize how much he had underestimated the ranch. Every day brought something new, something unpredictable, and he had to adapt quickly. The work was relentless, but it also made him feel alive in a way his office job never had. Despite their growing cooperation, tension between James and Clara remained. She was independent, outspoken, and confident, while James was cautious, methodical, and sometimes unsure. They had different ways of approaching tasks and different ideas about how things should be done. Small disagreements often flared into heated debates, especially when it came to repairs or planning the layout of the fields. One afternoon, while trying to fix a broken water pump, James and Clara argued over the correct approach. James wanted to follow the instructions carefully, step by step, while Clara preferred a more hands-on, intuitive method. Their voices rose, frustration building with each exchanged opinion. Finally, Clara threw her hands up and stormed into the farmhouse, leaving James feeling flustered and uncertain. He took a deep breath and realized that living with another person, even one as skilled and helpful as Clara, was going to require patience and compromise. James wasn't used to this kind of partnership. In his old life, decisions were his alone, and mistakes were private. Here, every action affected not only the ranch but also the person beside him. He needed to adjust not just to the land but to Clara herself. That evening, James reflected on the argument while sitting alone on the porch. The sky was dark, dotted with stars, and the air carried a faint chill. He realized that his frustration wasn't entirely about the water pump. It was about control, about the fear of stepping into an unfamiliar world and feeling unsure of himself. He needed to trust Clara's experience and knowledge, just as she had to learn to trust his willingness to work hard and adapt. The next day, James approached Clara cautiously, ready to apologize for letting his temper flare. To his surprise, she smiled as if she had expected it. "It's all right," she said. "We'll figure it out. We just have to learn how to work together without letting pride get in the way." James nodded, relieved. That moment marked a turning point in their relationship. While disagreements still occurred, they were learning to handle them with patience and respect, rather than letting frustration take over. As the weeks passed, James faced another challenge. Heavy rains had caused a small section of the creek to overflow, flooding part of the field and washing away some of the crops they had planted. James stood at the edge of the field, waterlogged and frustrated, unsure of what to do next. Clara arrived soon after, surveying the damage calmly. "This is temporary," she said. "We'll repair the fences and replant. Nature can be unpredictable, but we'll adapt." Her calm approach reminded James that resilience was key. He realized that life on the ranch was not just about physical labor. It was about problem-solving, patience, and learning to handle the unexpected. Together, they worked to repair the damage, reinforcing fences and creating small drainage channels to prevent future flooding. It was grueling work, but the shared effort strengthened their partnership. During this time, James began to notice subtle changes in his feelings toward Clara. She was no longer just a helper or a guide. She had become a companion, someone whose presence was comforting and motivating. He admired her strength, her knowledge, and her unwavering calm under pressure. Clara, in turn, seemed to respect James's determination, his willingness to learn, and his quiet persistence. They had formed an unspoken understanding, a rhythm that allowed them to work side by side despite their differences. One afternoon, while repairing the barn roof, James lost his footing and nearly slipped. Clara caught him just in time, steadying him with her strong hands. The moment was brief, but it left James with a rush of adrenaline and an unexpected awareness of their closeness. He realized that living with Clara was teaching him more than just ranch skills. It was teaching him about trust, reliance, and the subtle bonds that form when people face challenges together. Evenings on the ranch became moments of reflection and quiet connection. James and Clara would sit on the porch after a long day, sipping tea or coffee, sharing stories of their pasts, and discussing plans for the future. James learned about Clara's childhood, her love for animals, and the experiences that had brought her to this ranch. Clara learned about James's life in Ohio, his work as an accountant, and the quiet dreams he had long kept to himself. These conversations, simple as they were, deepened their understanding of each other and created a sense of familiarity and trust. Yet despite the growing bond, uncertainty lingered. James knew that their connection was unusual, forged under unexpected circumstances, and he sometimes worried about what the future might hold. Clara's life had been shaped by the ranch, while his life had been shaped by structure and routine. Could two such different people find common ground beyond the demands of the land? James didn't have an answer, and he knew he might not for some time. Meanwhile, the ranch itself continued to test their limits. A sudden outbreak of illness among the remaining animals forced them to work around the clock, caring for the sick and preventing the disease from spreading. James had never dealt with animal health issues before, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility. Clara guided him through the process, showing him how to administer medicine, monitor symptoms, and keep the animals calm. The crisis was exhausting, but it brought them closer together, revealing the strength of their teamwork and the depth of their commitment to the land. Through these challenges, James began to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. The ranch was no longer an abstract dream. It was a living, breathing place that demanded attention, care, and respect. Every repaired fence, every planted field, every healthy animal was a testament to their hard work and perseverance. He realized that the difficulties, far from being obstacles, were opportunities to grow, adapt, and prove to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. One evening, after a long day of work, James and Clara sat quietly on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air was filled with the scent of grass and earth. James felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the ranch, but for Clara, for her guidance, her patience, and her presence. He knew that this life was challenging, unpredictable, and sometimes exhausting, but it was also filled with beauty, connection, and possibility. As night fell, James realized that he had begun to see the ranch not just as a property he had purchased, but as a home, a challenge, and a place of transformation. Clara was no longer just a companion assigned by circumstance. She was a partner in every sense of the word, someone who had helped him discover new strengths and face unforeseen challenges. James understood that life on the ranch would continue to be demanding, but he felt ready to meet those demands with determination, patience, and an open heart. The days continued to pass, each bringing new lessons, new tasks, and new moments of quiet reflection. James learned to navigate the unpredictable rhythms of the land, to trust Clara's experience, and to embrace the uncertainty of this unconventional life. While challenges remained, and would always remain, he no longer felt overwhelmed. Instead, he felt engaged, alive, and connected to something far larger than himself. James realized that the ranch was more than a piece of land, and Clara was more than a surprise companion. Together, they were building something enduring, a partnership rooted in respect, cooperation, and a shared love for the land. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, James welcomed that uncertainty, knowing that whatever came next, he would face it with Clara by his side. As the weeks turned into months, James felt himself growing stronger, both physically and mentally. Life on the ranch was no longer a string of surprises and challenges. It had become a rhythm, one that demanded his energy, focus, and patience. Every morning began with the sun rising over the fields. Every evening ended with the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. Yet despite this growing routine, the unexpected presence of Clara still made James's days unpredictable. Clara had become more than a guide. She was a teacher, a partner, and sometimes a gentle critic. She had a natural understanding of the land and animals, a knowledge built over years of living and working there. James had started to admire her deeply, not only for her skill, but for her calm confidence in the face of every challenge. Yet he also realized that living alongside her was complicated. They were still two very different people. He was cautious, meticulous, and methodical, while she was bold, instinctive, and unafraid of taking risks. Those differences sometimes led to tension, even in the middle of hard work. One morning, James woke to a chill in the air. Frost had settled overnight, glistening on the grass and the rooftops of the farmhouse and barn. It was one of the first real frosts of the season, and it meant extra work. The animals needed warmer bedding, the water supply had to be checked to prevent freezing, and the fields required attention to protect the crops. Clara was already outside, moving with a quiet efficiency that reminded James of why she was indispensable on the ranch. James grabbed his coat and followed her. They worked in near silence, communicating through nods and brief comments as they went about their tasks. The cold made every movement more difficult, yet there was a strange satisfaction in facing the elements together. When they finished, they stood for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, and James realized how much he had learned about both the ranch and himself. He could now handle tasks that would have overwhelmed him months ago, and he was beginning to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment that had nothing to do with his previous life. Yet, despite their growing efficiency, an unexpected problem soon arose. A storm rolled in suddenly, bringing heavy rain and gusty winds that threatened to flood parts of the property. James and Clara rushed to secure the barn doors, reinforce weak fences, and move animals to safer areas. The wind howled, the rain soaked through their clothes, and the creek swelled dangerously, but they worked together without complaint. Each challenge strengthened their bond, creating a partnership built on trust and shared responsibility. After hours of effort, they finally sat inside the farmhouse, drenched, tired, and muddy. They laughed for the first time that day, relief and exhaustion mingling in a moment of pure connection. James realized that these trials, which had once seemed insurmountable, had become opportunities for them to rely on one another. He felt a growing warmth toward Clara, not just respect or friendship, but something deeper, a sense of closeness that surprised him. Over the next few days, life on the ranch returned to a slower pace. James took time to explore parts of the property he had not yet visited, learning about the land and imagining how he might restore neglected areas. Clara accompanied him, showing him wildflower fields, hidden groves of oak trees, and quiet corners of the creek where wildlife thrived. Each discovery was a reminder of the beauty of the land and the life he had unexpectedly stepped into. One evening, while sitting on the porch and watching the sunset, James found himself opening up to Clara in a way he never had before. He spoke of his past, his quiet life in Ohio, and the dreams he had long suppressed. Clara listened patiently, her eyes reflecting understanding and empathy. She shared stories of her own struggles and triumphs, creating a dialogue that went beyond mere work or survival. In these moments, the bond between them deepened, transforming from simple cooperation into genuine connection. However, the growing closeness also brought new challenges. James found himself becoming more aware of Clara's presence, noticing her laughter, the way she moved with ease and her natural confidence. He realized he was developing feelings for her that went beyond friendship or partnership, and the realization both excited and unnerved him. He worried about how these feelings might affect their working relationship and the delicate balance they had established. Clara, too, seemed aware of the shifting dynamics between them. She often caught James looking at her with an intensity that made her smile or shake her head in amusement. While she never acknowledged it directly, there was a subtle tension, an unspoken awareness that their relationship was evolving. Both of them continued to focus on the work, but beneath the surface, a quiet emotional current was growing stronger. The turning point came one afternoon when a wild animal had entered the property, causing chaos among the livestock. James and Clara worked together to secure the animals and protect the property. In the process, James was knocked off balance, and Clara reached out to steady him, holding him close for a brief, tense moment. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Both of them felt the spark of something undeniable, yet both quickly pulled back, unsure how to navigate the new emotions stirring between them. In the following days, the ranch continued to demand their attention. There were fences to repair, fields to clear, and animals to care for. Yet amidst the labor, James and Clara found small moments of shared joy. Cooking meals together in the farmhouse kitchen, watching the sun rise over the fields, or simply sitting quietly on the porch, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the countryside. These moments, though brief, were powerful reminders of the connection they shared and the unique life they were building together. One evening, James decided to take a walk alone through the fields. The sky was a deep shade of blue, and the stars were beginning to emerge, twinkling above the rolling land. He thought about how far he had come, from a cautious accountant living a predictable life to a man learning to embrace uncertainty, challenge, and connection. He realized that the ranch was not just a place of work, it was a place of transformation. And Clara, with her wisdom, patience, and strength, had played an essential role in that transformation. When he returned to the farmhouse, Clara was sitting on the porch, reading by the fading light. She looked up as he approached and smiled. "Long day?" she asked. James nodded, taking a seat beside her. "Yes, but a good one," he replied. For the first time, he felt comfortable sharing his feelings, admitting without words that he valued her presence more than he could express. Clara reached over and nudged his shoulder gently, a simple gesture that conveyed understanding and camaraderie. As winter approached, the challenges of the ranch intensified. Frost threatened crops, windstorms battered the fences, and maintaining warmth in the farmhouse became a priority. James and Clara faced these trials together, often working late into the night to ensure the ranch remained safe and functional. Their shared perseverance strengthened their bond, revealing the depth of their partnership and the resilience they could summon when faced with adversity. Through all of this, James began to notice subtle changes in himself. He was no longer the cautious, hesitant man who had arrived months earlier. He had become confident, resourceful, and capable of handling challenges he never thought he could manage. The ranch had taught him patience, resilience, and the value of trust, not just in the land but in the people around him. And most importantly, it had taught him the importance of connection, both with Clara and with the life they were building together. By the end of the season, the ranch had transformed. Fences were repaired, barns restored, and fields cleared and replanted. James and Clara had faced challenges, learned from mistakes, and built a life that was as beautiful as it was demanding. Yet the emotional growth they experienced together was perhaps even more remarkable than the physical restoration of the property. They had learned to rely on one another, trust each other, and appreciate the quiet power of companionship. As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, James and Clara stood on the porch, watching the land turn white. The ranch, once neglected and overgrown, was now a place of life, energy, and promise. James felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the land he had purchased at auction, but for the unexpected presence of Clara, who had guided him, challenged him, and shared in every triumph and difficulty. He knew that the coming months would bring new challenges, but for the first time he welcomed them. Together, they were ready for anything. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the beauty of the snow-covered ranch, James realized that life could be unpredictable and sometimes overwhelming. Yet, it was also filled with wonder, connection, and growth. The partnership he had formed with Clara had become a source of strength, comfort, and joy. And as they stood side by side, watching the land that had brought them together, he understood that the true value of the ranch was not measured in acres or dollars, but in the life, experiences, and unexpected love it had brought into their world. Winter had settled over the ranch, covering the rolling fields, barns, and farmhouse in a soft blanket of snow. James Harrison woke early one morning to the gentle hush that comes when the world is blanketed in white. The air was crisp and cold, and each breath hung in the frosty morning air. He stood at the edge of the porch, looking out over the property he had purchased months ago, and a sense of accomplishment washed over him. The ranch was no longer the neglected, overgrown place he had first seen at auction. It had been transformed through hard work, patience, and determination. But the greatest transformation had not been in the land. It had been in James himself. Living on the ranch had pushed James in ways he could never have anticipated. He had learned to wake with the sun, to care for animals, to repair fences and barns, and to plant and tend crops. Each day had tested his endurance and his patience. Yet the challenges had also given him confidence. He had discovered a resilience he didn't know he possessed and learned to trust his own judgment even when mistakes were inevitable. And through it all, Clara had been there, not just as a guide, but as a partner, a friend, and someone who had become indispensable to his life. That morning, as he walked through the barn to check on the animals, James reflected on how far they had come. The livestock were healthy, the barns sturdy, and the fields carefully maintained. Everything was in place, the result of months of hard work, collaboration, and problem-solving. Yet it wasn't just the work that mattered. It was the lessons he had learned along the way. He had learned to rely on someone else, to communicate without frustration, and to see the value in teamwork. Clara had shown him the importance of patience, adaptability, and kindness, and he knew he would carry those lessons with him for the rest of his life. Clara appeared from the farmhouse doorway, her breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. She was smiling, carrying a tray with steaming mugs of cocoa. James took one and they stood together, sipping the warm drink, looking out over the snow-covered ranch. It was quiet, peaceful, and full of possibility. "You've done a remarkable job here," Clara said softly, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the rising sun. "I knew you could, even if you didn't." James smiled, feeling warmth beyond the cocoa. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "I wouldn't have even known where to start." They shared a moment of comfortable silence, watching the animals moving through the snow, the trees standing tall and strong, and the landscape stretching endlessly before them. The ranch had become a living testament to their combined efforts, a place of life, beauty, and growth. And it had also become something far more personal, a place where trust, respect, and perhaps even love had begun to flourish. Over the following weeks, James and Clara continued to deepen their connection. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, finding joy in small moments of everyday life. James learned more about Clara's past, her love for animals, and the experiences that had brought her to this ranch. Clara, in turn, learned about James's life in Ohio, his quiet routines, and the dreams he had once thought impossible. These conversations, simple and honest, brought them closer together, creating a bond rooted not just in circumstance, but in shared understanding and mutual respect. One afternoon, James decided to explore a part of the ranch they had not yet fully restored. The snow had begun to melt in places, revealing hidden paths and small groves of trees that had gone unnoticed. Clara accompanied him, showing him how to care for the land, identifying areas where new crops could thrive, and pointing out spots that would make perfect pasture for livestock. As they walked together, James realized how much he had learned from Clara, not just about ranch life, but about resilience, compassion, and living in harmony with nature. The days passed, and the ranch continued to thrive. James and Clara faced occasional challenges, storms that damaged fences, small illnesses among the animals, and the constant work of maintaining the property. But these were no longer overwhelming. They approached each problem with calm determination, working together and trusting each other's judgment. Their partnership had grown strong, built on shared effort, communication, and a deep sense of respect. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, James and Clara sat by the fireplace in the farmhouse. The warmth of the fire filled the room, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the faint aroma of freshly baked bread. James realized that this life, the hard work, the challenges, the connection, had become something he cherished deeply. He thought about how different his life had been just months ago, how predictable and confined it had felt. And he realized that stepping into the unknown had brought him more fulfillment than he had ever experienced before. Clara noticed the contemplative look on his face and nudged him gently. "Thinking about how far we've come?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. James smiled. "Yes," he admitted, "and about how much I've learned not just about the ranch, but about life and about you." Clara looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the bond that had grown over months of shared effort and quiet reflection. It was a bond built on trust, mutual respect, and the awareness that they had both changed because of this experience. As winter gave way to spring, the ranch came alive with new growth. Crops began to sprout in the fields, wildflowers returned to their rightful places, and the animals thrived. James and Clara worked side by side, planting, repairing, and exploring, each day bringing new joys and occasional frustrations. Yet through it all, they found comfort and companionship in each other's presence. One morning, James woke to find Clara already outside, tending to the animals. He joined her, carrying feed and helping to clean the barn. They worked together in silence for a while, the rhythm of their task speaking louder than words. At one point, James caught himself watching Clara move with ease and confidence, feeling a deep appreciation and affection for her. He realized that what had begun as surprise and curiosity had grown into something much more meaningful. That afternoon, after the animals were fed and the fields inspected, James suggested they take a walk to the edge of the property. The sun was warm on their backs, the breeze carrying the scent of fresh earth and growing crops. They walked in silence for a while, enjoying the tranquility before James spoke. "I never imagined my life could change like this," he said. "I thought I would always be the same person living the same quiet life in Ohio. But this ranch, it's changed everything." "And you've changed everything, too." Clara looked at him, her expression softening. "It's been a journey for both of us," she replied. "And I think we've both grown stronger because of it. The ranch brought us together, yes, but what we've built goes beyond that." James felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of peace he had never known. He realized that the ranch had given him more than land or work. It had given him connection, growth, and the possibility of love. He looked at Clara, standing beside him against the backdrop of the fields, and knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Over the following months, James and Clara continued to thrive. The ranch was flourishing, the animals were healthy, and the land was productive. They had built a life that was both challenging and rewarding, filled with purpose, growth, and joy. More importantly, they had built a partnership, a bond rooted in shared experience, mutual respect, and a quiet but undeniable affection. As the seasons changed, James realized that his life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. He had entered the auction expecting a simple property, a chance to own land, and perhaps an adventure. What he had received instead was a home, a purpose, and a person who had become central to his life. The unexpected presence of Clara, once a source of confusion and surprise, had become one of his greatest blessings. One crisp morning, James and Clara stood together on the porch, looking out over the fields that stretched into the distance. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the land. James felt a sense of gratitude for everything that had led him to this moment: the auction, the challenges, the work, and the companionship that had grown into something deeper. Clara turned to him and smiled. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said. James nodded, feeling the weight and wonder of the words. "Yes," he replied, "more beautiful than I ever could have imagined." In that moment, standing side by side on the porch of a ranch they had nurtured together, James realized that life was unpredictable, full of surprises, and sometimes utterly transformative. The journey had been difficult, at times exhausting, but it had also been rewarding beyond measure. He had discovered strength, resilience, and connection. He had discovered the value of partnership, the importance of trust, and the quiet magic that comes from sharing life with someone who understands, challenges, and supports you. The ranch had been a new beginning, but it had also been a mirror, reflecting the growth and change that had occurred within James himself. And Clara, once a surprise and a mystery, had become the heart of that life, the companion who had walked beside him through every challenge, every triumph, and every quiet moment of reflection. As they watched the sun rise higher, casting light over the flourishing land, James felt a sense of contentment and hope. The future was unknown, as it always would be, but he no longer feared it. Together, he and Clara would face whatever came next, guided by trust, respect, and the bond that had grown over months of shared experience. The ranch was more than a home. It was a testament to what could happen when people embraced opportunity, challenge, and connection. James took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, feeling fully alive for the first time in years. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he also knew that he had everything he needed to face them: determination, resilience, and Clara by his side. And as the wind whispered through the fields, carrying the promise of new beginnings, he realized that the auction that had seemed like a simple opportunity had given him the greatest gift of all: a life transformed and a companion with whom to share it.